Welcome, everybody. We are continuing with our third panel on the second day of the European MMT conference. In this panel, we will discuss the Green New Deal, and we have a very exciting list of panelists. We have Professor Claudia Kemfert. She's head of the Department for Energy, Transport and the Environment at DIW Berlin, and she is a professor of energy economics and sustainability. Then we have Aske Voldsgaard. He is a PhD student at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose in London, and he's currently researching finance for renewable energy. And then we have Fadhel Kaboub, Associate Professor of Economics at Denison University and President of the Global Institute of Sustainable Prosperity. So I'd like to welcome our panelists. We have a number of questions to ask, and the audience is welcome to join us and send questions by writing them on the comments under the stream. And we will include those, hopefully, if we have some time. So I think we can start with our first question. So on the Green New Deal, a lot has been said about it by politicians around Europe and the US. But it seems clear that the phrase is perhaps being overused and now covers a variety of policy packages. So what, in your view, is the Green New Deal and why do we need one? And I'll ask the question first to Claudia Kemfert, since she unfortunately will have to leave us in about an hour, and then we'll carry on. So Claudia, what do you think? What do we need?
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Also, thank you for having me here this afternoon, and apologies that I have to leave already in an hour. Yeah, what is a Green New Deal? I mean, what we really need is a transformation towards more climate protection. We need an emission reduction by 80 to 95% in the next decade. So a zero emission economy in the next decades, and that's very urgent, and we are very late. Because in the last decades, as we have known, we should have done more. We did not do enough to transform the economy. We did not spend enough investments into renewable energy and move away and phase out fossil fuels from coal, oil and gas towards more renewable energies. And this is why we are so late and have to transform. So for me, the new Green Deal and the Green Deal is really to do two things. One is to really establish transparency in order to detect climate risks and also economic climate risks due to extreme weather events. We see that all over the globe that the climate is changing. We have droughts, fires all over the world, and this costs a lot of money. And we need transparency to show that. And the other thing is to invest into future technologies. That is, on the one hand, renewable energies, as I already said, but on the other hand, also transformation of the rest of the economy that relates to using renewable energy in all the different sectors by, for example, using electricity coming from renewables in electromobility on roads, but also on railways, and produce green hydrogen, for example, and use new technologies for this full transformation. I mean, the new Green Deal or the European Green Deal has a lot of goals, so not only towards zero emission transformation, but also to have and to meet different goals. That is circular economy and also a zero pollution Europe, sustainable agriculture, which is really a very important topic also to deal with, and sustainable transportation, as I already said, because we need also emission-free technologies in the transportation sector. So I would say what we really need is to establish transparency, finance the transition, and look at the economic risks on both sides. The economic risk coming also from climate change and extreme weather events and all the extreme events that causes economic damages, but also investment into future technologies. And in order to reach that, we need a framework. We will discuss this afternoon, but it's really important to to reach a zero economy, I would say, within the next 3 decades. Thank you.
Right. And just to expand on that, another phrase that is commonly used in relation to the Green New Deal is a just transition. Do you have any views on what this means and on why it may be important or not to a Green New Deal?
Is that going to me as well?
Yes.
Okay,
Please.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, as I already said, this just transition relates also to the structural changes we are facing. In Germany, for example, we had a long debate now in phasing out nuclear power and now coal. And in coal regions in the Western Germany, we already had a just transition. And that means to me that not only we look at structural changes going away from coal towards more renewables or energy transition, but also help with financial aid, for example, these regions which are affected by this structural changes to move forward and to provide new jobs and to find new business models, as we are doing right now in these affected regions in the eastern part of Germany, for example, and to provide also financial aid to do this transformation. And especially in the coal regions, for me, that is a symbol for just transition. In the past, where we already had a coal phase out in the western part, which is North Rhine-Westphalia, that started already in the 70s and 80s. So we moved away from coal, but nowadays we still have a very high share of coal power plants and also exploring coal and mining coal out of the ground. And that created a lot of jobs, that created cultural identities, and that's really important to deal with that and to take these concerns seriously and move away and help the jobs of the past to move to jobs to the future. And that is one region, that is coal, for example. But in Europe, that means that we have to deal with this kind of transformation everywhere. And we have coal regions in eastern part of Germany, for example, and Poland as well. And we have different kind of regions where we have to transform and do the transition. And that's really a long process we have to face and deal with this. And that's not easy, but for me, and this is how we in Germany at least understand also just transition, is not only to look at the transformation and, for example, make the right framework and economic incentives and all this, but also to look at the jobs and the social justice, climate justice and social justice, because low-income households, for example, might be affected as well, and they might be helped out of this situation. And this whole just transition process means that we are looking at a more broader sense or a broader perspective on the whole topic, and help those affected regions to get a way out of this.
Right. Thank you very much. So now I'll give a chance to ask Voldsgaard to say, what do you understand by a Green New Deal and what is a just transition within it?
Thank you very much. And thank you to Claudia for this great start to the discussion. I think she made a lot of good points. I would add something about the particular aspects of the governance approach that is implied with the Green New Deal, and that is that this is not a market-led transition. As Claudia said, we have postponed the decarbonization of our way of living for too long. So that means that we have compressed the speed of the transition that needs to occur. And what the orthodox economic answer has been to levy a CO2 tax and then let the market decide what's the best way of allocating resources in the economy. But the Green New Deal takes a different perspective, and that is too slow. And if it's even going to work, that is highly questionable. So this is a government-led approach that takes a whole society approach, so that ensures that there will be enough investment to actually make sure that all the new capital equipment that needs to come into being is being delivered, And secondly, that no one is left behind. Claudia made a great example of the regions in Europe that are highly dependent on coal extraction and energy production through coal. And one of the things that I find most problematic about the CO2 tax approach, or the market-led approach, is that it conceives people as consumers, first of all. So the progressive type of market-led transition is called tax and dividend. So, and the core idea is that if we levy a tax on what's polluting, then consumers will be hurt, because not everybody spends the same and have the same capacity to pay the higher prices. So we need to make a transfer based on their identity as consumers and the prices they face. What Claudia pointed to was that people are also producers, they are workers, they are, there's a geography to our current economic structure. So, and that needs to be disrupted. That is really what this decarbonization we're standing in front of, what it entails. We need to reorganize our way of living. And that just leaves some groups much more vulnerable. So the Green New Deal is a whole society approach to make sure that there are jobs for everyone and people get retrained and reskilled to have a place and a prosperous place in the new economy.
Right. Thank you very much for that. And Fadhel, Kaboub, would you be able to say what is a Green New Deal? Why do we need one? And what is a just transition within it?
Thank you. Well, I'll second everything my colleagues have said, and I'll just add that we need many Green New Deals all over the world. Fundamentally, the Green New Deal is about addressing the climate crisis and addressing, in the context of the US, the crisis of inequality, socioeconomic exclusion, and so on. But on a global scale, these are global problems. Obviously, it doesn't matter where the CO2 emissions are coming from, whether it's from Berlin or New York City or Lagos, it's all going into the same atmosphere, essentially. So we can't really address these multiple crises from a purely European perspective or American perspective or a Japanese perspective. And I see some questions and comments coming through the chat about what is the place for developing countries and how will developing countries address these crises as well. And in this context, since we're on an MMT panel, it's important to remember that from an MMT perspective, we're talking about the fiscal capacity of the state or of the government to tackle these challenges, which requires a massive amount of infrastructure spending, research and development spending, and so on. And countries essentially sit on a spectrum of monetary sovereignty, which means different countries have different fiscal policy space available to them to tackle these crises. And it just so happens that the wealthiest countries, the countries with the highest degree of monetary sovereignty, also happen to have the most in terms of technological capabilities, research and development capabilities. So naturally, they have a larger responsibility to play. And number two, those countries happen to be the countries that are the most responsible for CO2 emissions since the Industrial Revolutions. So there's a financial, technical, moral obligation, so to speak, for the global North to play a role in introducing a global series of Green New Deals. That's point number one. Point number two, in terms of just transition, the phrase just transition has different meanings in different countries because of the historical use of the phrase. For example, in the US, unfortunately, it's a phrase that has a lot of negative connotations with the labor movement in particular, and faces a lot of resistance in the context of the US, because it was used in the past to essentially throw people under the bus, promise workers that there will be a just transition, quote unquote, with free trade policies, and there'll be retraining programs and new jobs, and communities were left essentially with no jobs, especially in the deindustrialized Midwest. So the fossil fuel workers today, and workers who would be displaced because of this massive structural transformation that we're about to undertake with the green transition and the Green New Deal. It's natural to see that resistance from some workers. And when you talk to workers in the fossil fuel industry, sort of behind closed doors, off the record, they'll say, of course we want the green transition. Of course we want green jobs. Of course we want clean air and clean water for our families and so on, but not at my expense. In other words, why would I quit a unionized job in the fossil fuel industry? Why would I quit a six-figure job with benefits and go look for training and pay for it out of pocket, and go look for a job that pays maybe $60,000, $70,000 a year, and lose my pension benefits and lose all the benefits that my union fought for, and join an industry that's not unionized? Of course, they're not going to be the ones sacrificing their quality of life and their livelihood and so on. So it's very important for us when we think about the green transition and a just transition, not to leave these issues to the market to resolve or to workers to figure out on their own. So it's very important because we're so late. We needed a Green New Deal 20, 30, 40 years ago. We've known about this since Silent Spring, since the 1970s. So the time is really short, and it's important for the federal government, in the case of the US, and other national governments, to actually underwrite the full cost of the transition, to guarantee the transition, not just in terms of jobs, but to also guarantee that workers are transitioning into jobs and pensions that are equivalent or commensurate with their existing fossil fuel quality of life. And if we have that, then we can have a just transition and call it a just transition, but it can't be just empty promises. In terms of, and I'll close with quick, excuse me, a quick comment about the Global South. If we take the existing renewable energy technology that we have today, which is great and it can get us far, but it's not sufficient to get us to a circular economy that my colleague was mentioning earlier, truly circular economy. In other words, if we solarize the entire world with the existing technology and put wind turbines and geothermal technology and so on, this requires a massive amount of extraction of minerals and natural resources, mostly from the Global South. And that can't be called a just transition for the whole world. So we need to repair the damage also in the Global South. And this is where we have an opportunity for a massive amount of research and development in material science, right? In order to produce the technologies and the infrastructure that will truly give us a circular economy. And then finally, to finance the just transition in the Global South, I've talked about the concept of reparations, climate reparations, colonial reparations, not just in terms of monetary transaction and in-kind transfer of technology, but also repairing the broken structures, economic structures, global financial architecture that's been extractive, that's been abusive in the Global South. And I'll just put one number on the table for us to consider to see if we're actually going to be successful with any kind of green transition under the current institutional setting in the global financial system. If you net out all global financial transactions between Global North and Global South, we have $2 trillion a year moving from the poorest countries to the richest countries. We're not going to have any kind of green transition or just transition if we have a global financial system that's constantly sucking wealth from the Global South. So all of these things need to be repaired and restructured in a way that's actually fair and equitable, and that will actually allow us as a globe to actually succeed in this climate challenge. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much. And as you mentioned, there was a question from the audience that you've already covered, but I guess I'll give a chance for the other speakers to answer to that. And the question was from Claire Jackson-Prior, and she asks, in what ways can the wealthy countries of the world help a just transition of developing countries? And she puts the example that, for example, in our current model of aid, and I guess she refers to the UK mostly, it encourages exports of primary products as well as foreign currency loans, which makes the developing world situation worse. What would you have to say to this? And I'll start with Professor Kemfert.
Well, actually, I would move this question to the other experts, because we did not do a lot on global financial aid related to the question that has been addressed. I mean, we are very much focusing on climate impacts and climate justice. So here, my answer would be to really focus on financial instruments that help also the transformation and move away from fossil fuels and nuclear towards more renewables, especially in the global south. But also, I mean, if we're looking at the climate change, there will be tremendous damages all over the world. We already face that. We see a lot of migration from the global south to other regions of the world, and these kind of costs have to be paid. And that cannot be paid alone by the developing countries. So we have a global responsibility to do a lot and move away and help those regions really to adapt on the one hand, and also to do everything we can do to protect the climate and avoid these kind of huge damages. I know that was not the exact question that has been raised, but I'm pretty sure the other colleagues could answer to this appropriately.
Okay, thank you. Asker, would you have something to say about that?
Yeah, and I'll pick up where Fadhel left off when thinking about finance, because in the global north there is still a very much the struggle is very much alive, whether we have this state-led approach, the Green New Deal approach, or more market-led approach, because the political economy is working against the market-led approach, because who's in power, these are the firms, the companies and their owners who will get hurt most directly by these taxes. So we're in a stalemate, which is dire enough. But that leaves open space for politicians who want to take a more functional finance approach, such as what Joe Biden appears to be doing right now. And it might also spill over into European politics now. However, in the global south, we see a different dynamic. We have the multilateral financial institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions, IMF and the World Bank, who are working or govern quite deliberately to make sure that all these infrastructure investments are being financed by financiers in the global north. Daniela Kaboub has described this as the Wall Street consensus, as a new phase in this new era of decarbonization, taking over from the previous Washington consensus. So this is where the global governance of finance and decarbonization is adjusted and controlled in order to make infrastructure in the global south investable and bankable to financiers in the global north. And what does that mean? There's a lot of risk in these investments. That's also why the states have historically carried out these investments in the global north, while there are immense benefits to it. So that means that they're building a de-risking paradigm in how infrastructure is governed in the global south. And what this shapes up to be, or to result in, is just added transfers of financial value from the global south, as Fadhel just mentioned, that there's a net transfer going that way. That is definitely not what needs to be going on in a global Green New Deal scenario. So I think we need to rethink how the World Bank and the IMF should be governed in order to support developing countries the most. And one of the things I think is necessary is for them to allocate capital goods credits directly to projects that we know will help their green transition. Because right now, when state aid is given to something that sources local resources, all that foreign currency ends up in the national financial systems, ready to purchase luxury goods for the local elites. So I think we need to have an international financial system that makes sure that the foreign currency that is available and made available by political means that is actually helping them to decarbonize. And I would love to hear what, especially what Fadhel thinks about such a rethink.
Thank you for that, Asker. And of course, feel free to reply to what Asker has said about finance and the role of finance in this. But we'll also ask the next question, which is related. And it says that, so those who champion private enterprise, they often see the Green New Deal as an excuse to increase the size of the government. So what do you think that the role of the private sector and public sector should be in delivering the Green New Deal? And how does the Green New Deal benefit or disadvantage either of these sectors? So Professor Kemfert?
Yeah, I think what is really important is that we have a framework for the markets. And I mean, the private sector is important because we need investments. And here the financial sector comes also into place because, of course, we need also here from the financial sector the right framework, not only to invest, but also to establish the transparency, which is necessary to detect the climate change and the negative climate impacts. Could you hear me? Because I feel now some. Okay, is it working? Because my internet is quite
yes,
strange.
Yes, it's working.
Okay, sorry. The financial market is really important here because we need, on the one hand, the investment into the future markets, but on the other hand, also transparency. And if we're looking at the so-called sustainable funds and also the green funds, we see a lot of movement, but not everything is green and it's really sustainable in that sense that it's really protecting the climate and causes sometimes even more harms. And that's one thing. The question was related to the private sector. Of course, what we need is a government which provides the right framework so that the markets can work. On the other hand, right now in the transformation phase, we need also more investments, more spendings into infrastructure, as Asker was saying, and into also load infrastructure, electricity infrastructure, and all that is needed for the transformation, and financial help also for private companies to move forward. One example is green hydrogen. We need hydrogen that is produced from eco-electricity, from renewable electricity, but here we need investments, and these investments are come not from the market because the market is not there. We are at the very initial phase of this new technology, and here we need to move forward. But so we need a financial aid and also incentives that the investment is taken, and the Green Deal is doing here a lot. And then the private markets need to establish and also to move forward. And I think that's really important to see that on the one hand, we need a framework, but then the market who's also reacting. But right now, the framework is not enough, neither in the financial market nor in the other markets. So we need much more improvement.
Right. Thank you very much. Professor Kaboub, would you like to comment?
Yeah, lots of really interesting questions in the chat and things to comment on. So I'll try to organize my thoughts quickly here. On the scale of intervention, and I'm looking at the European Green Deal, for example. I think the EU is looking at something like €1 trillion worth, €1 trillion worth of investment in the Green Deal over the next 10 years or so. Which is substantial. When we talk about trillions, it's not a joke. But when you look at the actual plan, we're talking about 1% of the EU's collective budget. That's not substantial enough in terms of scale. And when you look at the details, quite a bit of it is expected to come from the private sector too. So it's not direct fiscal spending. So that's something that should make us at least pause and think carefully about what is this thing that we call bold transformative action. It turns out to be about 1% of GDP. Point number 2 on the role of the private sector, and I'll be the first person to tell you, yes, there is a role for the private sector. This is not going to be all government. But we have to be very careful not to let the private sector, in a specific segment of the private sector, set the terms of this transition and set the terms and the scale of what we would call a Green New Deal. when the last IPCC report came out, not the most recent one, the one from 2 years ago, major financial institutions started doing their own research, and most of them came out essentially saying that the IPCC people who are telling us we have 12 years to act on a massive scale, those guys are actually optimistic. They found out that it's actually much, much worse than that. And they were looking at it from a financial sector perspective. And what they were looking for are the financial risks that are embedded in their balance sheets. We're talking about the carbon bubble here. And we're talking about trillions of dollars worth of assets globally that will become stranded assets with the impact of climate change. So the financial system, especially here in the US, was panicking quietly and calling on the US Federal Reserve, the SEC, the US government to actually take action. Not action that the green activists and the rest of us are calling for, but they have a very narrow focus, which is green investments and green transition to the extent that it protects their assets. Because we're getting to a situation where now you have financial institutions who refuse to finance mortgages in certain areas in the US, flood risks and fire risks. We have insurance companies who refuse to insure properties. And you have trillions of dollars worth of assets in oil and gas, in tourism and real estate that are at-risk assets that are sitting in endowments, university endowments and pension funds and all over the place. So they're looking for a framework to mitigate those financial risks and stop there, right? So only do what is necessary to protect our interests, to protect our assets, which is helpful. Yes, we need them in moving in that direction. We need a transition in the financial system. So that's why the Fed finally joined the Network for Greening the Financial System about a year ago, NGFS. The ECB also joined. The Fed now has a climate change committee. The ECB has a climate change director. These are all very good things, but we should not let those institutions alone determine the path and the limits and the scope of this intervention. There's a very important role for the fiscal side, for the regulatory side, to have a strategic plan to actually phase out the use of fossil fuels, not just tame the risks of fossil fuels. So those are important things. And unfortunately, despite all the positive progress we've seen in the last few years in Europe and the US and other places, it's still relatively tame and slow progress in terms of the scope of the problem that we're trying to deal with.
Okay. May I add one sentence, because I find this really important, what you said, and would like to add that especially this carbon bubble is exactly what I meant with transparency, because right now we only have, we have a framework and there are financial risks related to climate change, but also to fossil fuels. And right now we see a lot of stranded assets, toxic capital in all the balance sheets all over the globe. And the financial companies, institutions say, well, we are looking for sustainability, we are moving away. But if you're looking exactly what's in the balance sheets, not only in the funds, but also in what is invested in individual companies and individual projects, we see still a large amount of fossil fuel. And this carbon bubble is huge. It's really huge, and it could create a new financial crisis if we do not react. And it depends really on the markets, but also on the framework right now. We have the Paris Agreement, Green New Deal. There is a reality of climate protection coming. We have rulings all over the globe, in Germany, in Australia, in Denmark, and saying, well, we have to move forward with climate protection. There is a serious effort right now in climate protection, so it becomes more and more reality. And this is why there is a slowly asset stranded component in all these individual investments. And the financial markets, of course, has no interest to provide this transparency. I'm even not sure whether there's a huge awareness of this, but this is a huge problem we are facing right now, and moving this big ship, so to say, towards a more sustainable future is really difficult, and it becomes really difficult to manage this. We need clear signals, we need clear goals also from climate protection. We need transparency, what is in the balance sheet, what is in the market. We need clear rules, not only for the companies, but for the financial companies and all the rest of all individual companies, fossil fuel companies as well, in demonstrating and showing and make it transparent what is the climate damage you have on your balance sheet, what is the risk, what is the financial risk you have related to fossil fuels, related to climate risk, and make that transparent and act from there. But unless we don't have that, and we are just, hiding all the information and just look at financial numbers in a way that always growth is the answer and not the sustainability related to that and the climate damage related to that, we will not manage to get this transparency and let the market go. And this is what I meant also with the right frameworks, not only on the policy side, CO2 prices, all the rest which is now investment which is triggered, but also related to the financial markets. We need a transparency here and need to make this effort really ongoing, and ask the companies to provide this transparency in order really to see what's ongoing, and then we can react, and then we see, and hopefully we will not get a second financial crisis because of this toxic capital we have everywhere and create bad banks all over the globe, which costs us a huge amount of money. Sorry for being so long now, and I just wanted to provide that this is really a huge problem we have, and we have to face and get the transparency into it. Thanks.
No,
if
thank
I
you
may
for
add
intervention.
just one sentence to summarize this, because this is, I agree, this is extremely important. Last year alone, I think there was almost $500 billion worth of oil and gas capital expenditures, additional investment in stranded assets. And if we agree that climate change is a serious thing, and if we agree that these assets are toxic and stranded assets, why are we building more as we speak? So for me, every oil and gas executive that signs documents to approve the construction of more, capex in oil and gas, every minister of energy, every government official that signs these approvals, they're doing one of two things. They're either signing our collective suicide pact because they understand the impact of what they're doing, or they're committing huge fraud because they're duping investors into buying stranded assets, into putting their money in toxic assets. It's one of these two things, and we have to take legal action against what is actually happening because the evidence is there. These are toxic assets, which means it's a fraud, and we have climate change, which means you're signing a collective suicide pact for all of us.
Yeah, but we need a way out of it. So I completely agree. And there's a huge problem related to this because we have this toxic capital all over the globe. And we're doing something like a suicide. From the German perspective, we are still investing into fossil fuel infrastructure, Nord Stream 2 pipeline, for example, which is a fossil fuel gas pipeline, which we don't need. We need no new oil. We need no fossil fuel at all. And if you talk to Wall Street bankers, they tell you, I did that. And they told me, well, look, we do not believe in this stranded assets because we do not believe climate protection becomes reality. And I think they're wrong. Because I completely agree what you said, because we have the Paris Agreement, because we have the Green Deal, because we will move forward, because we see the people all over the globe and feeling and seeing that climate change is happening. And there are rulings in Germany, in Denmark, in Australia, and the court is now saying, well, you should believe in climate protection, and this is ongoing, and we will even see more stronger goals. And this is why it's so important to not to do suicide and not to move into a financial crisis, but really to move out of there and invest into the future. Sorry to do that here now bilaterally, but I think it's such a crucial point for the discussion. And thanks.
Okay, can we ask? I'll just ask Voldsgaard if he has any comments on this discussion and on the role of the private sector and the public sector in the Green New Deal.
Yeah, very much so. I'd like to to pick up on the discussion on the climate-related financial risk, because it's a bit of a conundrum, and both my colleagues touched upon it, that are these assets, are they stranded? Or we're not doing enough, or else we're being duped, as Fadhel just said. And right now we know that we're not doing enough. So that is maybe the concerning point there. And in relation to that, this whole narrative and policy approach around climate risk exposure and getting more information, which is good in and of itself, there is a risk of a conservative bias in that, because we learned from the great financial crisis that we should be really afraid of a financial crisis. So if we detect that there is a lot of financial risk in the system, that could turn in as a boomerang into a timid approach to decarbonization, because we don't want to cause a big financial crisis because of all these stranded assets, or because we are stranding the assets as a policy choice. And that, from my background is political economy, and you can already hear that is unlikely to happen given how politics works in this day and age. So and now I'm bringing it back to MMT, because what MMT is bringing to the table is to make absolutely clear the fiscal capacity of developed countries. And this is where I think we need to discuss about having more focus on how these stranded assets can be taken off the balance sheets of the financial system and put into conservation and wound down, and while we invest heavily in renewable energy and all the technologies that are needed in order to electrify other sectors. Claudia mentioned hydrogen earlier, which needs a lot of capital expenditure in order to provide new fuels for transport and also for the agricultural sector. So I think we need to highlight that role of the state, that is able to bear losses. And I saw there was a question about that as well. So I think we need the state involved in that and taking the losses of the stranded assets, because I think otherwise we're going to face a political economy obstacle that is just that might mean that while we want those who invested in what we knew was going to be stranded assets to take the losses, I'm afraid it's not going to happen due to politics. So that's one place where we can use the fiscal capacity of monetarily sovereign states. Another role for the states is that MMT has made absolutely clear what the state can, and that it's inflation. That's the boundary of public spending and net spending into the economy. But it's not in and of itself an argument why it's desirable. It just means that it's possible. So I think the MMT scholarly community, there's a great potential to link up with the evolutionary literature and evolutionary economists who focus very much on the state's role in innovation historically, in the IT revolutions, in pharmaceuticals and so forth, and also in decarbonization. Solar PV comes from R&D spending in the US that got carried forward in the Japanese market, where there was a niche market, and then Germany came along with the Energiewende, the great green transformation that was where Germany was a pioneer in the early 2000s and ongoing, which enabled these absolutely fantastic cost reductions in solar PV. That is actually enabling that is the cause why we can sit today and talk about decarbonization as a realistic strategy. And parallel to that, also wind energy technology, which was pioneered to a large extent in Denmark, where I'm from. And what we see in those stories, these technological histories, is that the state had such a crucial role to finance these projects, not just the R&D where neoclassical economists would focus on on the market failure in the R&D system because you cannot capture all the gains from science as a private company. No. Governments have come in, created large markets where private companies could compete and find the best solution. So that is one of the roles for the private market, that it competes and drives down costs, finds better solutions. But it does so in a close cooperation with the state, because the state has the ability to be patient and embrace risk. And one of the reasons for that is what MMT focuses on, because it has the financial wherewithal to do so. So I think there's a lot more to be said in that regard in relation to future technologies, and also how to get rid of all the old stranded assets.
Thank you, Asger. I think this subject on the finance, the question was asked by Sam Levy on who writes down the fossil fuel related assets and who takes the brunt of that cost. And I think that's something that we can continue to discuss. But I know that Professor Kemfert's time is limited, and I wanted to ask this question for her before she leaves. So the next question is a common line of attack of the Green New Deal it is that it's too costly, it's too expensive, and it risks unsustainable levels of government debt, and therefore we cannot afford it. What would your response to this be? Do you agree with this statement?
No, I would not at all agree, because it's not costly and it's not expensive, because we have to do the investment, and that's a typical excuse of those who said the same in the last 20 years and we did not react. They always said it's too costly, we cannot do climate protection, we cannot do invest, we cannot move away from fossil fuels. And we just discussed, we have stranded assets, there's a huge cost related to fossil risk, there's a huge cost related to climate change. We are paying all the time. With our budgets, we are not talking about it, but in Germany we had a big flooding this year, which was really expensive, 30 billion, or only this flood. That's the first assessment. We don't know at the end how much it really is. So in the US now, today, showing a new number that extreme weather events costs have been increased tremendously, and comes to numbers which are really, out of scope. And that is really cost we always have to take into account. So we are talking about, and that is what my answer is always, let's talk about the cost-benefit analysis. If we talk about costs, talk about the benefits as well. You do that with every project, you do that with everything that is decided, but only when it comes to Green Deal, to climate protection, to sustainability, to transformation, there's only this cost argument in saying, well, we cannot afford it. We cannot afford it not to do it because climate change is too costly, because there is, no way out. We only have this planet and have to move forward and do whatever we can do to become more sustainable, not only in technology transformation, but also in terms of new jobs and new job modes, so to say. The future of the economy is different of what we have known in the past, where we have just economic growth is everything, and that is harming the environment and the climate and all the rest, and we are not looking at it. That is over. We really have to change and to move forward in a way that we are more in balance with the climate, in balance with the economy, in balance with the people and the society. And that is what is really the great effort we have to do and have to take into account right now. So my answer is clearly the cost benefit answer to it is always, yes, we have to invest right now. We have to transform. We have to do the transition in a right way, not in a way that in the past it has happened sometimes, but do it in the right way that will really at the end have no one left behind, that we have a good jobs and a good life for everybody in a sustainable environment, in a sustainable climate. And that should be the goal. And whatever it takes, we have to do that. And then the benefit is so huge that we have to move forward, I would say. And there's this cost argument is always, to my opinion, an excuse, and that we should overcome that and really talk about cost benefits.
Thank you. And I'll just ask you one more question before you have to go, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Somebody from the audience is asking how, related specifically to the EU and the austerity rules in the EU, how does a country subject to the EU austerity rules, can they promote a New Deal? And is there something that should this be done collectively as a group, or can each country do their own New Deal?
Well, I mean, it's a group. We have defined it as Europe as a group that we are all as a team together and stick to the rules that we have. But on the other hand, we have to do everything. I mean, we learned from the Corona crisis how quick and fast we can react in order also to help people and help the economy and do the rest. And that is something we should take over also and move forward towards a more sustainable and climate-friendly planet. And here we are a group, of course, and have to stay together and do it as a team. There are different roles in this whole European framework, for sure. We have countries like Germany and France, and we have others in Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, where they have all different conditions in their individual countries. But at the end, we have one common goal. We start at the very early phase now and start together and also come to this common goal, which is the Green Deal, the Green New Deal, and everything that is provided and needs to be provided, really to move forward and go in the right direction, as we already discussed, with the framework that is needed from all the different policy angles, but also from the financial market. We have to do, and really to prepare that we should avoid this worst case scenario related to climate change, related to economic and also society blackout, so to say. We have to avoid that and move forward. And I would say, yes, Europe has a common goal and is a group and wants to move forward and should move forward together.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Kemfert. I won't take any more of your time. I know that you are have somewhere else you need to be. So thank you for being here and for your answering the questions.
And thank you for having me. And sorry for leaving earlier. And have a good discussion. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
So, Fadhel, I think we haven't given you a chance to answer of how is the Green New Deal too costly, and are we going to destroy the world under unsustainable levels of government debt, or what would your angle on this be?
Well, very good question. So from an MMT perspective, well, let's start with the mainstream, first of all, where that question comes from usually, which is the assumption that too much government debt, too much government deficits and spending will eventually lead to inflation. Higher interest rates will bankrupt countries, right? And the framework suggests from the mainstream perspective that governments are constrained in terms of how much they can spend. They're limited by the tax revenues they create and the borrowing capacity that they can tap into from the private sector. Beyond that, it's going to be inflationary. It's going to be problematic. Well, MMT is essentially saying the spending capacity of a sovereign government is actually much larger than that. It's not infinite. It's not unlimited. It's actually constrained by the risk of inflation. So this whole debate fundamentally becomes a debate between MMT and the mainstream side on what actually determines the risk of inflation. And the assumption in the mainstream is that it's too much government spending, it's too much deficit, it's all of that. And now, today, even the mainstream recognizes that they don't really have a basis for those arguments, because look at the last 10 years. Look at Japan, the largest debt to GDP ratio in the world, negative interest rates, deflation, no risk of inflation in sight, right? Even the more recent, appearance of inflation in the last year or so is really related to, supply chain disruptions and things related to the COVID crisis and so on. But they're kind of trying to come back and say, oh, we told you inflation is coming because of all the big government spending. So the MMT focus on the actual risk of inflation looks at the root causes of inflation. And to me, it's two major sources. One is the availability of productive capacity. In other words, if you have disruptions in the supply chain, if you have limited capacity in terms of technological capabilities, real resources, skilled labor, then yes, additional demand will cause prices to go up. And that risk of inflation, we can deal with it with strategic investments, with more resilient supply chain, with investments in productive capacity in particular areas that constitute inflation pressure points for the economy. We know how to do that, and we can create millions of jobs in the process to tame the risk of inflation. The second risk of inflation, source of inflation, is abusive market power. When you have key players who can raise prices simply because they can or because we let them, then you're going to have prices going up. And you can think of this in the context of the US and probably other countries. Think of the power of pharmaceutical companies, energy companies, telecommunication companies. These are not competitive markets. These are the power of the oligarchy is essentially concentrated in those areas. And that kind of inflation, you're not going to eliminate it by implementing austerity policies. You can only tame that risk of inflation and eliminate it by taxing and regulating their market power out of existence. And this is why for MMT, it's very important to decouple the spending on the strategic investments that we need to build a resilient economy, to tame the risks of inflation, to build a more resilient supply chain, and so on. That spending is separate from the taxation and regulation of abusive market power, of pollution, of speculation. Those are important things. So it's not taxing to fund, it's taxing for strategic reasons, it's spending for strategic reasons. So that's how I would frame the discussion about inflation, and that's why when you go back to mentioned earlier, which is the EU's Green Deal budget, which is mostly relying on private sector funding, it's misleading because it's within the parameters of the Maastricht Treaty, that there is a fiscal constraint on states. There's only so much they can do, so we're going to do it within that framework. And I'll add one small comment on, just to build on what Asker was saying earlier, which is very important in terms of the risks associated with financing the green transition and relying heavily on the private sector. It's a double risk. And many of us in the MMT community have been talking about a double Minsky moment when it comes to climate change. Now, the mainstream Financial Times and other places, they talk about a Minsky climate moment, which is great. I'm glad they're talking about that for the last 10 years. But there is a second Minsky moment that's actually embedded in this transition, which is purely economic risk, kind of a classic Minsky moment, which is financing a technological boom for this green transition by accumulating more debt in the private sector. And that's the risk that Europe is taking with its approach to the Green Deal. Because if we're financing this technological boom in the green sector for the green transition via private sector debt, then you're building a classic Minsky moment, in addition to the carbon Minsky moment that's about to happen as we speak. So it's extremely important for that green transition not to be funded via kind of a hedge, speculative Ponzi cycle in the private sector, which is typically what the private sector does if we let private sector be in charge of this green transition.
So what advice would you give then, just to follow on to Stuart's question on what advice would you give to EU states that have, specifically Eurozone states that don't have monetary sovereignty with regards to the Green New Deal?
You have to rethink the rules that the ECB follows. Either create a truly fiscal union that actually uses the fiscal capacity of the bloc and doesn't have that artificial constraints, or something else that allows for additional fiscal spending at the individual state level. But you can't keep the Maastricht rules, the 3% rules, and the austerity rules, and hope to deliver, meaningful action on the climate front. It's just not going to happen.
Right. Thank you. Asker, what is your view on this idea of the Green New Deal being too costly, and what does that mean for Eurozone nations?
Well, first of all, I think Randy Ray gave a fantastic presentation yesterday at the conference where he clearly laid out that if you do the resource math, it's not that costly. One of the things that contributed to the good math of providing resources for the green transition in the US was that the extremely expensive medical system, and on top of that, the forever wars that need to be scaled down, and that's in the process right now, as we see on the news. Other countries don't have such a defunct medical system, including Europe, but we have another thing. We have the Eurozone architecture, which has left so many people unemployed, especially in the southern European countries. So that is a huge resource base to activate in the green transition. So in order to avoid the kind of pay-go mentality that you need to tax somewhere, you need to scrap something in order to be able to spend. So I think this is a great opportunity to reverse this trajectory that the Eurozone has caused it really the entire Europe to be on, which means that also from a geopolitical perspective that Europe is just falling behind while the US and China are ascending, and Europe is just mired in its own financial affairs, rooted in monetarism and the whole process of how monetarism shaped the architecture of the Eurozone, which Bill Mitchell has described really well in his book, Groupthink. So I completely agree with Fadhel that the Eurozone needs a complete makeover into a fiscal union or a breakup into countries with their own currencies. The crisis has forced the hand of the leaders in the Eurozone. So now they're doing what Stephanie Morale calls these fiscal off-balance sheet entities. I'm not sure that's the exact concept, but it is this off-balance sheet mentality that we know from private finance. We cannot have this spending on our fiscal balance sheet, so we're inventing all these special purpose vehicles that allows us to spend and at the same time provide some interest income for the financial sector. And it's just not sustainable, because we can see that the Southern European politicians, that they learned the lesson last time around. They got hit by austerity. They haven't spent in this crisis to protect their economy the same way it's been done in the North, and the reason is obvious. They don't expect the fiscal leeway to be carried forward into the future. They expect the logic of the Eurozone to kick in again and hit them hard with further austerity and privatizations of crucial infrastructure embedded in that policy process. So there needs to be a complete rethink, especially now the 8 countries from the North primarily have just sent what's called a non-paper, a position paper, that they want the fiscal rules from the Stability and Growth Pact to be reinstated now, although there is a rethinking process occurring about how to adjust the fiscal rules, because it's apparent to everyone who's not completely embedded in this type of thinking that there needs to be a rethink. We cannot resume the old rules, because if you have passed the debt threshold of 60%, you need to scale back by 5% or so each year. You cannot do that if you have 120% of the public debt to GDP. You cannot do that. You will have a revolt. You won't even be able to do it, as we saw in the Eurozone crisis. They didn't even manage to get that debt down when they imposed austerity, and that's the balance sheet approach, or the sectoral balances. You cannot determine your own fiscal or your net fiscal position. It depends on the economy. But they've just sent this position paper, and it just tells me that the Eurozone is not on the right track. So while we have these these investment constructions that Fadhel just mentioned, where you hope to crowd in a lot of private finance, I won't be banking on it. I think it's not going to work, and it's not enough what they're doing, and they do that all the time. It was also in the previous package where they leverage up their estimates, and it's just not. There's no sign that it's going to work. This one is more ambitious, but it is definitely not enough. So I don't feel very optimistic about the Eurozone. I have another point about the fiscal sustainability part of the question, whether this will be so costly that the interest rate on public debt is going to accelerate and so forth, and that is the orthodox perspective of public debt. And Fadhel mentioned Japan, right? That 260% debt to GDP and negative interest rates. And I think just before COVID, they were even heading towards a position where they earned income on their debt rather than paying on it on a net basis, according to the IMF. So that was completely remarkable. And what is that telling you? It tells you that monetary policy interest rate is what it really is, what it's called. It's a policy tool. It's not something that for sovereign nations or monetarily sovereign nations, it's a policy tool, not for developing countries with public debt and foreign currency and so forth. And that has not yet been completely connected in the MMT perspective. In the MMT literature, it's about whether this is a policy tool or not, and it obviously is. The answer is clear. But this, and the policy implication of that is usually to implement a permanent zero interest rate policy in order not to reward financiers for not doing anything, which Keynes called the functionless investor. However, there's a crucial point in relation to decarbonization, and that is that this is a huge investment program that we are undertaking, and we are about to accelerate quite dramatically. And all these investments, furthermore, they have a high capex ratio. It means that a lot of the spending that goes into a wind farm has to be put up front. When you install the park, there's not a lot of operation and maintenance. And like a coal power plant, you don't have to feed it all the time during its lifetime. So you need to put a lot of money up front all the time. So that means that financial conditions are super important. The IEA, the International Energy Agency, has calculated that if interest rates rise by 4%, then offshore wind energy, the electricity coming out, is going to be 43% more expensive. And this is the electricity that's going into electrolyzers that will provide the fuels for heavy shipping and for aviation and so forth. And if you increase the cost of that due to raising interest rates because you're afraid of inflation or what have you, despite we've just seen for a decade that it's not working to control inflation, as Fadhel just mentioned as well, then we're just going to make the deep decarbonization super expensive. So I'm really, really worried that we are going to accommodate the financial sector in its investment in the electricity sector, which will prevent us from decarbonizing deeply in other sectors such as industry and transport. So that's just a further argument for that undergirds the MMT position of a permanent zero interest rate policy.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. And there's been quite a few questions on this specific subject. So I'm going to ask you this as a big question. So I am aware that some environmental economists argue that the pursuit of never-ending economic growth is completely unsustainable, and therefore that we need to scale down or degrowth our economies. And in that context, the creation of employment is associated with inherently contributing to more growth and therefore more carbon emissions. So what are your views on this? And can the Green New Deal's focus on employment be compatible with carbon emissions reduction? And I guess Fadhel, would you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, I completely agree with the idea that the obsessive focus on growth is misleading and dangerous. And this is not a recent problem. This is a fundamental problem with macroeconomic thinking for a long time. And the metric that we use, which is GDP, which is what we use to measure economic growth, is the misleading metric that needs to be replaced. And many of us in the MMT community, Phil Lawn and others have talked about using what I call the GDP's closest cousin, which is the genuine progress indicator, which essentially takes the basic GDP numbers and then removes all the negative components of it. For example, every time there's an oil spill and we have to clean it up and we spend $200 million cleaning it up, GDP goes up by $200 million and it gets celebrated on TV as economic growth. Every time we pay for the negative consequences of pollution, whether it's cancer treatment or building prisons or cleaning up water sources, all of that spending is called economic growth. Every time we go to the hospital for breathing related conditions related to pollution, GDP goes up. So if you remove that negative spending out of GDP numbers, you get the genuine progress indicator, which should be the metric for a Green New Deal, which should be the metric for the economy. And once you look at that metric, and if you want to increase GPI, which is the pure quality of life indicator, then the questions become, well, what are the types of investments that will actually increase GPI, increase quality of life? And those become essentially all the Green New Deal investments that we've been talking about. So then it will be, yes, job creation, but it's job creation that's helping decarbonize the system, that's helping making this equitable, and as a result, not necessarily focusing on GDP growth. Because if you wanted economic growth, build more oil and gas pipelines. That's GDP growth, right? But from the GPI perspective, that will be a reduction in GPI. So that's how I would frame the discussion. It's focusing on decarbonizing the economy, making it more equitable, and using a metric that allows us to assess progress in that front. And if it means more jobs, that's even better.
Okay, thank you. And Asker, what would your view on this is growth as decarbonization compatible with growth and compatible with job creation?
It's a really tough question, and it's one of the big ones. I completely share Fadhel's position on the need to shun GDP and move over to more well-being focused metrics to guide our investments and our economic priorities. That being said, I think that it's very possible that all these investments that we have in front of us, especially over the next decade, in order to decarbonize our production systems and transport systems, that they it's going to be such a massive stimulus that it's going to increase GDP, or unless something really radical is done. And I'm not saying it should not be done, but I'm kind of agnostic. GDP might very well go up while we decarbonize quite deeply. So I'm not too fixated on GDP, and that's a debate that's going on right now online. It's indicating is that GDP can be dematerialized and decarbonized. The question is can that be done globally? And that's much more questionable if we're just shifting the polluting industries elsewhere. So we might need to move more radical, and one of my favorite policies in that regard is shorter working weeks. I think that is a way to get the labor movement going again, which is another important point from a political economy perspective, that labor movement needs to be deeply involved and find their previous key policy that they need to, that regular people should work shorter hours each week to be able to do all the stuff that's important in life. And that just fluctuates and dovetails so nicely with decarbonization. And again, you only see that if you focus on well-being rather than GDP, because GDP goes down if you produce less. less time on the job. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. But obviously, the job guarantee is immensely important here, because that is the primary tool that allows you to decouple full employment from growth, because you can that enables you to shift structurally how your economy produces and transport without causing major unemployment while this transition is underway. That's why I've just published a green job guarantee proposal for Denmark. We had a discussion in the parliament the other week, because the politicians are quite afraid that this restructuring, especially also in agriculture, that is going to create a political backlash. So I think the need to decouple employment from growth cannot be overstated.
Thank you. And maybe I'll add a little bit of my own comment to that. Just as a means of seeking clarification from you both. So GDP is a function of spending, right? It's just a measure of spending and added private and government spending. It doesn't really discern as to the quality of that spending or what that spending is being used for. As Fadhel rightly said, if there is an oil disaster of sea, then that will be seen as creating growth because of all the efforts to the cleanup and stuff. So in that sense, the view, and there's a question from the audience here that says that green growth is impossible. But would that effectively be like saying that all human activity is effectively, destructive to the environment? Or could we, if we were to direct spending and therefore growth towards activities that we deem to be beneficial to the environment, maybe using the genuine progress indicator as a means of measuring that, does that mean that therefore that we can have an improved quality of life without destroying the environment in the way that we're seeing that we're doing at the moment? Fadhel, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I didn't want to limit the framing of this to just GDP and GPI. This is just one piece of the puzzle. I think the clearest and most coherent approach to thinking about growth and sustainability is Kate Raworth's donut economics framework, which puts economic activity in its place, which is within an ecosystem, within a social and ecological framework. And going back to the comment that Claudia brought up earlier, which is producing that circular economy is the right framework. And the current context of economic growth and thinking about jobs and growth in that sense is completely inconsistent with the circular economy. And this is a multi-pronged framework. This is not just a one decision that's going to trigger everything else to change. We have to completely rethink the way we produce and consume and transport and work, and everything has to be rethought essentially. And it starts with a few major decisions, which is decarbonizing the system is one major issue, because we know CO2 emissions is one of the biggest climate challenges, which means rethinking transportation, which means rethinking architecture and urban design, which means rethinking food systems, which means rethinking education and vocational training to create the jobs that will actually allow us to staff the new economy that we're envisioning. So all of these things have to be rethought simultaneously in a coherent framework. And the problem that we have today in many places, and Europe included, is that fiscal authorities, because they've determined that their fiscal spending capacity is limited, have abdicated their role in envisioning a better world. And the more they do this, the more responsibility falls in the hands of central bankers, for example, who now increasingly see their role as the leading force for addressing climate change. And as a result, their sounding board is the financial sector and its needs. So who's going to determine the rethinking and envisioning of the world for us? It's going to be Wall Street and central bankers within their worldview. And that's really the dangerous situation that we're in, that we're seeing central banks increasingly being relied upon, not just to manage the economy, but now to manage climate change for us. And there is a role to play, of course, for central banks. And this is something that I didn't mention earlier. There's something that should have been introduced long ago and can be introduced immediately by central bankers. As a matter of fact, the longer they wait, the more difficult it is that they're going to, handle climate change. Because think of this carbon bubble and the way that Greenspan was thinking of the economy a couple of decades ago, instead of a crash related to the impact of climate change in the financial sector. Let's think of it in terms of soft landing, right? So that you gradually deleverage the system from carbon assets and so on. One of the things central banks could do immediately, and this is not my idea, these ideas have been around in the green finance world for a long time, is regulatory changes that essentially segregate on balance sheets green assets versus carbon intensive assets and create different capital adequacy ratios for green investments versus non-green investments. And if you just create that distinction, you automatically create the incentives for bankers to invest in the green sector because you automatically make it more profitable. And you automatically trigger incentives to look at the non-green incentives as riskier, less profitable, more dangerous stranded assets on your balance sheets. So you trigger the private sector to do the right thing. It's a small component of a bigger puzzle, but it should be done immediately. What are we waiting for? So I'll leave it at that.
Right, thank you. Asker, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, because that process is underway in the EU. We have the sustainable taxonomy, and there were calls for, as Fadhel has just raised, to have these fossil fuel assets, have them highlighted. So potentially you could increase capital requirements for it. But that's not the way it's gone. They invited BlackRock in to carry out some of the design of this taxonomy, and they are obviously not without a stake in this area, having trillions of dollars under management, and now we are the policy is just in a quagmire because of discussions over whether fossil gas should be included as a transition technology. So it's obvious on the at the first step. I completely agree with Fadhel. But when you enter the political economy of this, it just fails, or it doesn't look very promising. You obviously have to go that way and not leave it to private labels, as we saw in the great financial crisis, where the financial risk was completely mislabeled by the labeling agencies. But it's just such a struggle due to the embedded power of fossil companies and fossil interests. And what I'm fearful of right now is that it's just being turned into a virtue signaling process. That is about asset managers telling us how many green assets they have under management. And that's fine. And this relates to our previous discussion about divestment, and the climate risk that we need them to get rid of the assets. But the problem is, we as MMT economists, we apply a macro view. So all these assets, they don't disappear, they get snatched up by private equity and other industries that work more in the shadows, such as the petrochemical industry. There seems to be a push now for them to purchase some of the oil assets and just continue to run them. So while I'm really sympathetic to the push to have green labeling and improve transparency and so forth, I think it also, the weaknesses of that approach underlines why we need a Green New Deal approach rather than the central bankers approach. As Fadhel said, it's not going to be enough if we push the task in that direction. It needs to be a fiscal agency-led transition in close cooperation with sectoral ministries. And the political economy risk there is obviously the theories of public finances that are dominant right now treasuries around the world.
Okay, thank you. And we've got another question from the audience from Stuart Medina, and I'll let Asker answer this first. Stuart Medina asks, what do you think about the CO2 emissions market and its impact on electricity prices? Is this a smart way to promote the transition, or is it just income extraction? I think you're on mute.
I realize I've put forward a few critical remarks on carbon pricing and such, and that is, I'm not against carbon pricing at all. I'm against the orthodox approach that if you do anything else, you are making the green transition more expensive because it's not market-led, and that will backfire because people don't want wasteful spending. So that's their approach. And I'm saying that is completely orthodox, and that's not how big technological transformations occur. We didn't move to a computer because we started taxing typewriters, and equally so we didn't invent whole new technology classes such as modern wind turbines and solar PV by taxing fossil fuels. We created markets, subsidized and created markets that allowed economies of scale and learning by doing to occur, and had R&D around it and built industrial ecosystems. And when you have these technological alternatives, when they mature enough to be within striking range of the fossil fuel industries or technologies, then you can really effectively use carbon pricing to give the low carbon technologies the edge, and that's where the shifts happen really quickly. So that is, I'm happy to see the carbon tax in EU proliferating and increasing and now being expanded. It's great, but we need the state to use its fiscal capacity and its ability to be an entrepreneurial state and investor of first resort, and also in collaboration with productive private companies, innovative ones, to build the next generation technologies. And I don't think that carbon pricing is going to do that, because there is too much of a gap in terms of cost efficiency between new technologies and incumbent technologies that have been enhanced for ages.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for that. And Fadhel, what would you say about CO2 emissions markets?
I'll second everything Asker said. I'll just add a little bit of framing here to it, which is, essentially what we've been talking about the last few minutes is, we're dealing with the forest fire using water pistols. And the carbon pricing tool is part of those, slightly bigger water pistols, but it's not going to get us anywhere. The other comment I wanted to add to Asker's insight earlier about the political economy constraints, in MMT we're always told, are you descriptive or prescriptive? And when it comes to this particular issue, MMT is actually shining a bright light on that political economy constraint that Asker was talking about there, and saying, well, this artificial constraint can be addressed via the democratic process, via recognizing that the fiscal authority has a much larger spending capacity. It created these artificial constraints. It's handing essentially the keys of the economy to the private sector and the financial sector via central bank policy, when the world of possibilities is actually within the hands of the fiscal authority, democratically elected, a government of the people, by the people, for the people, which is what we want to be in charge of the sets of policies to save our lives, to save the planet, to save the economy. That's really what the prescriptive part of MMT is telling us what the possibilities are, what we're missing, and why those constraints are can be addressed in a democratic way, in a transformative way.
Okay, thank you. And the next question is about resource mobilization. Can the Green New Deal be compared to the resource mobilization efforts such as those of the World War II? And what does the Green New Deal have in common with those efforts, and how is it different? Asker, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll refer to Randy Ray's presentation yesterday and his numbers and the rough calculations in the talk I've done was that while World War II required 50% resource mobilization, the Green New Deal might require 5%. So there's an order of magnitude there in a difference. So that's the first part. I know measures of what it would take in Denmark, where we are further ahead than the US economy, which is still quite carbon intensive. The number is 2% of GDP. So in those terms, it's really not that much. It just needs you're just required to have the right framework and don't see constraints which are artificial and take them for granted. So quantitatively, it's not the same thing, but there are some qualitative aspects that are similar. That we are dealing with a restructuring. We need a lot of activities still to change its nature, how we produce steel, how we transport things, and so forth. So there needs to be a lot of coordination in the economy, more than we've been used to. So I think what we can find inspiration from is that coordinative part of war mobilization, but it's on a much smaller scale.
Right, thank you for that. And Fadhel, what would you say about it?
So I'll maybe use the case of the US as an example just to illustrate here. So Green New Deal spending will be large-scale spending, transformative spending. But it always carries the risk of inflation from an MMT perspective, risk of inflation related to the availability of resources, labor resources, technological resources, physical productive resources. So let's say we decide we're going to spend $10 billion next year to employ 100,000 people to solarize a particular region in the country, which is what we should do, and install wind turbines and so on. And we're going to pay those people decent wages, decent benefits to have decent quality of life, right? That's step number one. We can do it. We have the fiscal capacity to do it. But those individuals now have a decent income. They have, they live in a free country. They're going to increase demand for housing, for transportation, for entertainment, for whatever it is. Money is going to, go through the rest of the economy. So yes, our spending is only on solarization and kind of decarbonization of electricity, but its impact is going to ripple through the system. So before you even start the $10 billion spending, you have to think of the potential inflation pressure points that it will generate because of the additional demands on resources. So if we notice that there's going to be an additional demand for housing in this part of the country, that's going to trigger the abusive market power of real estate companies. If there's going to be an additional demand for transportation, that's going to trigger too much demand relative to the capacity of the public sector to provide transportation or automobiles or whatever, then we know that $10 billion spending will be inflationary. So before we spend the $10 billion, we have to think of complementary policies, strategic policies to tame the risk of inflation. And that could be taxing and regulating the real estate market. That could be building public housing, affordable housing. That could be building additional capacity in other areas of the economy so that when those initial 100,000 workers are spending their money into the economy, they're spending in a way that doesn't actually trigger additional inflation pressure points. So instead of spending $10 billion on decarbonizing the grid, we can spend $9 billion in decarbonizing the grid and $1 billion on public housing, as an example. And this way, your $10 billion will be transformative and non-inflationary. And once you discover this mechanism, you can think bigger than 10 billion. You can think 20, 30, 50, as long as you're thinking in a multi-pronged way, not just focused on one particular area of spending. And once you discover that, the sky is the limit, meaning the limits are not how much you can spend. The limit is how much you can logistically and administratively manage risks of inflation and manage the implementation of this. And in that framework, you can think of the role of the private sector to play its part. So you think in a transformative way at the macro scale, then you allow room for the private sector to do its best. Whereas the current situation is we think of what the private sector can do and how we can incentivize them to move in the right direction on a relatively small scale with all the additional risks that it involves. So Keynes's framework and the framework that Randy Ray and Yeva have developed for the Green New Deal is absolutely the right way to think of scaling up Green New Deals on a massive scale within the physical and technological limits and the real constraints in a way that allows us actually to simultaneously, as we spend more, as we build more, actually tame the risk of inflation and abusive market power more and more. Whereas the mainstream framework, if you spend more, you're automatically causing inflation. And here we're saying we can spend more to reduce the risk of inflation.
Okay, thank you. And I think we've come to the end of the session, but I think we have a few minutes for any final statements, if there's anything else you'd like to add. Asker?
Well, I haven't prepared any grand statement, but it was a big pleasure. I loved discussing with you. Great questions, Patricia, and I wish all the participants a great conference for the remainder.
Great. Is there anything else that you'd like to add, Fadhel?
Well, I didn't prepare any grand statements to close this, but I really enjoyed the conversation, and the questions in the chat are absolutely the right questions and the issues to think about. And I think it's great to celebrate our community in this MMT conference and to kind of inform and empower and mobilize people to put the right questions on the table. I think one of the trademarks of the MMT community is not to keep these conversations in-house or keep them in academic circles, but basically take them to the streets, take them to the political space, because that's where action needs to happen. And once you enlighten people's perspectives with the world of possibilities that we've been discussing here, I think our movement and our approach is unstoppable. And I think the last few years have just demonstrated this in Europe and the US and other parts of the world. So this is it. Go out and do it.
Great. Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank the audience for your comments and your great questions, which were quite a few, and I'm sorry I didn't manage to put them all forward to the panelists. And again, also thank you to the panelists for their fantastic contribution. And the next panel will be panel 4 on political economy of fiscal policy, and that is at 4:15 Berlin time, which I believe it is 3:15 UK time, so just about in half an hour. So I believe Christian will be moderating that. So that's thank you from me and to the panelists. Goodbye now.